Well, hello everybody. Larry Young here, and today on OLaMan Living Life with Purity, I want to talk about how Rome City came to be called Rome City. Great story there. So let's start back. About 1800 or so, the people in the United States were still just settling territories. And as part of that, what they needed to do is they needed to come up with a way up here in northeast Indiana as to how to get their grain and other marketable items to the markets in Chicago. And there was no roads or anything at that time, so what they had to do is they had to take things by barges on rivers. And what they wanted to do is connect all these rivers so they could have a navigable waterway to get them from northeast Indiana all the way to the Chicago area so they could drop off and make money. So that being said, they needed help. And what they needed to do, since Indiana was not a slave state, what they needed to do is bring in workers. So what they did was they brought in fresh immigrants from England and Ireland. And it was a great idea, but bad planning because the people from Ireland were not real happy with the people from England, and England was not very happy with the people from Ireland. Basically because the people from England shared a Protestant faith, and the folks in Ireland were primarily Roman Catholic. So when they got here, the differences didn't go away. They just kind of got exacerbated as they had to go through their work life. So what happened in this area, there was a little town settlement called Northport, Northport. And Northport was just north of what is now Rome City. And it had a tavern, it had the Justice of the Peace, and it had a trading post, and it was run by a fellow by the name of John Law, L-A-W. And what John did was he kind of ran things in the area, being the tavern owner, trading post operator, and the Justice of the Peace. So he was pretty much everything all in one stopping point there. And so Northport held all the settlement for the English canal diggers, and so they populated that area. But when the Irish came, they didn't let them live with them, so they made them go settle down in the swampy areas, down in the lowland areas, which wasn't very nice of them, but it was how things were at that time. So they weren't getting along together, and they weren't working together by day because the work crews would keep them separated so that none of them got killed, because they were pretty murderous against each other. So one night, probably mid-1830s, the Irish camp was having a great party. And they had lots of liquor flowing, and people were just having a good old time. And a few of the fellows from the Northport camp ventured down to see if they could join in on this. Well, one thing led to another, and apparently a fight broke out. So when this fight broke out, one of the larger men from the Irish camp came around, and he grabbed these two guys, it was said, by the backs of the necks, and he clapped their heads together and says, "Hey, when you're in Rome, you do as the Romans do." And he was just trying to keep the peace and keep them settled down. But these guys didn't take it too well, so they went back to their camp, and they started mocking the Irish guys and all like that even more. And so as a group, the Protestants began calling the Irish the Romans. And so anytime they called them the Romans, it wasn't a calling regard or favor upon them. They were mocking them as being the Romans. So hostilities didn't go away, and the mail service was trying to deliver mail to these Irish guys down in the southern camp. But everything was addressed to Northport. And so the postal handler over at Law's Tavern there just said that, no, we're not going to take their mail, forward it on to Rome. Basically trying to tell the mailman that, send it to Rome, not here. But the mailman didn't know what was going on between the Protestants and the Catholics, and so he didn't get the joke. So, not being any wiser, he forwarded the mail on to Rome, and there was a Rome, Indiana at that time, which was clear down at the southern part of the state. And so what they would do is they would have to take this forwarded mail by wagon as far as they could to get it down to southern Indiana. Well, when it get there, the postmaster down there said, no, this stuff all has to go back to Northport. So it would come back through. So several months later, the Irish guys were finally getting their mail. But the postmasters of both Northport and Rome, Indiana got together and said, we're not going to stop this feud, this fight, anything like that that's going on. So why don't we just go ahead and name their town Rome? Well, they couldn't do that because they already had a Rome. So what the two postmasters decided on was they would name Rome City in this area where these Irish were camped out. So that's how Rome City came to be, by the after effects of a large drinking party and a couple of level-headed postmasters just deciding we'd go ahead and we'd make a second Rome out of this. We just called the second one Rome City so there wasn't any more confusion. So that's how Rome City came to be, and in 1839, Rome City was born. But they made them wait 29 years to get their own post office. So Northport still maintained control of the postage, and eventually, though, Northport died, and no one's there anymore. And it's just a name and a road. And Rome City took over. And because it had all the greater advantages, the recreational areas, just all those amenities grew up around these Irish Catholic settlement. So at one time, for people who want to do the math on this, at one time, Rome City was 94% Roman Catholic, and 6% as either non-believers or, other selections, I guess. And now it's almost completely the opposite. It's basically 6% Roman Catholic in Rome City and 94% non-Catholic. So the tide has turned, and things are going in a different direction. But it's still how things came to be out there. So that being said, in 1868, they got their own post office, and then Rome City was definitely on the map then at that point. So after that, Rome City area grew into a really strong recreational area because of these lakes and rivers that have been made by the work of these canal diggers. And so the area is becoming very popular for sport fishing, for recreating, because they made a lake which became Sylvan Lake. And so people were coming up and recreating on that. And it was just a grand old time for 30 or so years there. People were coming out. They had festivals out there. They had all sorts of things. It was a huge gathering point. And they ran it was a Grand Rapids in Indiana Railroad, ran a line out to Rome City so they could connect the railroad to that area, because so many people wanted to come from the Fort Wayne area to recreate in the Rome City area. So they made the train available to them, and it was a well received amenity to the area. So what was needed for this recreational area when they had all these, fishermen and swimmers and all like that coming out? Well, they needed sport fish, and they needed a lot of it because these were new lakes that were being made, and they didn't have a heavy population. So one gentleman set up a fish hatchery in the area just south of Northport and the north side of Rome City. And he built a fish hatchery, and he raised trout and other species to release into these rivers to entice the sport fishermen to come into the area. Well, this was going great guns until the late 1890s, and the sport fishing and all like that was starting to wane away, and people were looking at other places to go have fun. And so the Rome City recreational area started to fall off a little bit, although it was still strong. It wasn't as strong as it had been. And so this fish hatchery fell onto tough times. And it was at the same time that the people in the area were begging Catholic bishops to help them find a doctor that could come to this area and help them out, because the nearest doctor for these folks was over 40 miles away at Fort Wayne. So if these people got sick or anything like that, it was really pretty much up to them to deal with their holistic type of medicines and things like that they had, and just try to cure themselves. So in search of a doctor, the pleas fell on the ears of the Archbishop of Cincinnati. And he looked at the situation and thought to himself, well, I think I've got a guy that could go up there and help them out. So he knew about this one gentleman that was in the seminary by the name of John. John Knoll came from Fort Wayne, Indiana, and his father was a local apothecary. So John was very familiar with herbal remedies and things like that his father had been making all these years as he watched his father work. So he was, very much associated with the style of medicine of the times and things like that. So he was well versed. He was also a very, very strong scholar and had a very high business acumen. So the Archbishop reached down into the seminary and pulled John Knoll out and says, hey, I need you to go back home. The folks up in your area need a doctor. There's a young doctor in southwest Michigan by the name of Geierman who practices a form of healing called the Kneipp water cure. So he says, Knoll says, well, what do you want me to do? He says, I want you to get this doctor to relocate to the Kendallville area, Northport area, so that these folks can have a doctor. And so Knoll went back and was released from his studies for a bit. He went back, he met with his Dr. Geierman, and Dr. Geierman said he needed a place with a strong source of water year-round that he could do his medical practice, which had huge amounts of spring water as part of the cure. And so Knoll found out about this fish hatchery in Rome City area. And so he dialed in on that, and he and the doctor went to visit it, and it was perfect. It had all the water that they needed. It already had baths set up, if you will, which were basically these large holding tanks for the fish. And there was a small structure that was there already. And so Dr. Geierman made an offer on the property and was successful in purchasing it, but his terms were that Knoll would have to stay on as his business advisor in the process there, because he realized how strong this man was in his business acumen. So Knoll goes back to Cincinnati, talks to the Archbishop down there and says, hey, got a problem. I said, this guy won't do this unless I'm involved as his business advisor. And he says, and I want to be a priest. And the Archbishop told him, says, well, I got news for you. You're going to be a priest and a business advisor. Go back and get this thing going. So Knoll goes back, gets with Geierman, agrees to his terms. They end up buying the property, and Geierman starts working his Kneipp water cure with the existing facilities, making modifications, of course. He got rid of the fish and other things like that. But he kicked the fish out and started putting the people in, so as his method of healing. So things went very well, because Dr. Geierman was never without patients, and he never had a break, and he didn't have people around here to help him. So after a couple years of great success, Geierman gets a hold of Knoll and says, hey, got a real problem here. He says, I'm not cutting it here. I need help. I can't get help. I'm going to have to leave. And Knoll says, oh, my gosh, we can't do that. So he goes back to his Archbishop friend down in Cincinnati and says, we got a problem. And the Archbishop says, no, you got a problem. What is it? And Knoll says, the doctor's overwhelmed. He needs help. And we can't find any help for him to move out there because there's nothing out there for these folks. It was in the middle of nowhere. The Archbishop kind of closes his eyes and says, I think I know something. Because he was aware of at that very moment there had been a sister from the Precious Blood out of Dayton, Ohio, who was under his direction, was just coming back from Vershofen, Germany, where she had been made a doctor in the Kneipp method of healing. So the Archbishop contacts the Mother Superior at the Precious Blood in Dayton, and one thing leads to another, and the Precious Blood sisters end up buying out Dr. Geierman with one condition, that John Knoll, or now Father John Knoll at this point, stays on as their business advisor and spiritual director. So John Knoll is now cast as the business advisor and spiritual director for this new facility going into Rome City that would practice the Kneipp method of healing. So Noel has been kind of cast into a role that he wasn't expecting, but he was ultimately the best person for the job at the time. So Noel with the sisters, they take a bag full of cash and they start building. And they built and built and built. And they started building the structures that are now the Patroness of America Center. They started building that and putting up rooms and healing facilities and things like that. And the sisters rarely had a vacancy. They just kept building. They needed more rooms all the time. They'd put in 16 or 40 new rooms. They'd be filled up. So what they had to do is they had to expand, and they had to expand quickly. So these sisters went on a building spree that lasted all of about 16 years. And in that time, then they went from a 16-room facility to a 248-room facility. And all this with Father John Noel at this point, then helping out with the planning and direction that was going on. So with the Sisters of the Precious Blood getting involved with all their healing arts there in Rome City, it just grew and grew and grew, became one of the top places in the country for people to go for healing, because hospitals weren't even around yet. They didn't even put out the first pharmaceutical drug until 1918. So up until that time, people were using these herbal remedies. Basically, holistic medicine was the practice of the day. And the sisters were very successful. They didn't take on surgical patients and things like that, like you would have in your typical hospitals, but they would take on people that had chronic conditions. And a lot of people would come for a stay for several days or weeks, and even some people would stay for years, decades, with their chronic conditions. They basically became in-house patients that the sisters took care of. So Kneipp Springs ended up having a lot of different points of interest that were going on. And I was reading through, I think that they said that they took care of over 1,500 patients every year. And so that's a lot of people to be running through a place that size, no matter how long they're staying. That's a lot of people to run through there. But that's what the sisters did. And they were running the facility, great guns, up to the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, until the 70s, when things started to slow down a bit. Families were taking their options and going to other places that they had always wanted to go to, because the federal highway system was coming into vogue, and so people could get from one end of the country to the other in their automobiles. So that was when it was popular to see the USA in your Chevrolet or Ford or Pontiac or whatever you were driving. So the sisters are doing good, and they needed help. In season, what they would do in their high season, the summer months, they would bring in more sisters from their other facilities around the country. And they would bring in up to 40 extra bodies to help with the summertime work. And I think they went with a regular crew of about 38 during the winter months, which they still stayed open and maintained their services. So with a full crew of up to 80 sisters in the summer months, that called in when our sister who had the visions there, Sister Mary Ephraim, she was called into service there in 1956. And it was in the fall of 1956 that she said she experienced these apparitions of the Virgin Mary coming to her as Our Lady of America. So that's how things happened and took place, and how we got to today's situation with this devotion that we talk about, and are called to live life with purity, and what that all means in our lives and our days. But if we kind of go back to that original settlement with those Catholic Irish canal diggers and what they went through, there's a great story in that as we go forward. So kind of cool, but I think it's just really funny that the town of Rome City ended up getting its name because of a beer bash gone bad. So God has a way of taking garbage and making it into something, and I think that's what happened there. So I think it's funny. I hope you do too. And next time I talk about this, I'll go further into details for you. I think you're going to have a great time with it. So that's how Rome City got its name. And I hope you all enjoy that story. See you next time.